Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the May Q&A virtual lunch hour with me, your host, Jason Killeen. I'm an Assistant Executive Director with the Department of Cannabis Regulation. With that, let's go ahead and jump into the questions.
Good afternoon, Jason and everyone. Our first question comes from Maggie Espada. My oldest brother did prison for having marijuana on him decades ago. Can we as a family try to receive a grant or assistance for this business in order to sell cannabis?
If your brother was verified as a social equity individual applicant, he would be able to submit a request to our social equity team to find out what benefits he could get through our social equity program, whether it's access to the learning management system, potentially a referral to the pro bono, low bono program, or fee deferrals in order to assist him with moving through the application or licensure process.
Our next question from Ariella J. When will DCR issue the renewed temporary approval certificates for the 2024 calendar year?
That is a very good question. We're planning to issue digital certificates sometime in June while we work through the mechanics of printing the annual license certificates with the Department of General Services. So we hope to get those digital certificates out sometime in June.
An additional question from Ariella. If a licensee surrenders the premises and the record is deemed abandoned, eligible for refile, can the licensee resubmit in the same CPA where the location was previously abandoned, even if undue concentration was reached?
The simple answer is yes. One of the revisions we had done to the code in recent years would be to allow for a refiled application not to be subject to a finding of undue concentration, provided it is refiled within the same community plan area.
Great. Moving on. Stephanie R. asks, for the upcoming renewal, will cultivation, distribution, and manufacturing need to have their public health permit to renew, or is it just retail?
The municipal code only requires retail to have received their public health permit in order to complete the renewal for the 2025 calendar year. Within LAMC 10423, I believe, that's where it has the requirement for every retail storefront operator to have possessed an emblem by January 1st of 2025 in order to continue operating. So right now, because the emblem is only a component of the retail storefront licensure process, only the retail storefront operators are required to have that public health permit.
A question from Jesse F. At what point during the annual license process can a social equity applicant apply for a provisional license?
Assuming that the social equity applicant is applying for a state provisional license for either the type 10, which is for retail storefront, or the type 9, which is non-storefront delivery, you would be able to apply for your provisional license at any point. The state will require evidence that your record has received a status of local compliance underway. It's considered filed by the Department of Cannabis Regulation, and we've begun the environmental analysis for your project. If you are applying for non-retail activities, the state's no longer issuing provisional licenses, so you'd have to wait until you received your annual license to meet the requirements for a state annual license.
An additional question from Jesse. Are there any updates on the cultivation licenses and when they will become available for social equity applicants?
Another great question. So we're proposing to amend the municipal code to allow DCR to conduct a lottery to select social equity applicants who would be able to submit an application for the remaining cultivation capacity. That recommendation should be forthcoming sometime later this summer.
KCK asks, can you explain the DCR process and timeline for site location approval?
If the question is tied to the pre-application review process, which is where we do our initial land use review to determine whether or not it complies with Municipal Code Section 105, that generally takes 30 to 90 days from the date that the pre-application review fee is paid. Generally, we get the review completed within 30 days of the payment of the fee. But if your proposed location may be within 700 feet or, from a sensitive use for retail storefront or 600 feet from a school for non-storefront, we may have to request additional information from you, like a premises diagram, so we could do more exact measurements, which of course will take a little bit longer.
From Ronnie M. If we are running out of time to find funding and building for our license, could we extend the pre-application period?
The simple answer is no. The code only allows for the pre-application record to be valid for up to 1 year. When we deem the pre-application record eligible for further processing, basically it insulates that proposed location from new sensitive uses coming online within that 1 year period. If you don't file your application within the 1 year period, you will have to refile a new pre-application record and go through a new land use review.
From Samuel M. I was selected for a social equity license. I still haven't found an investor. What would you recommend to find investors so I can open up my dispensary?
So if you were selected either through phase 3 retail round 1 or phase 3 retail round 2, I would recommend that you reach out to the social equity team and participate in any of the events that they do. Oftentimes they have subject matter experts that come and provide training. Some of the training and webinars have been based on investment, raising capital, and other things that may be of interest of you. Unfortunately, the department does not provide business or legal advice, so we can't help you find an investor. But by participating in different social equity program events, you may be able to network with other social equity entrepreneurs and folks looking to invest in and or finance a retail cannabis business.
Next question from Levon E. Are all phase 1 storefront retail exempt from counting towards undue concentration?
Phase 1 businesses count towards the they count towards undue concentration. So any phase 1 storefront license counts as one license in a community plan area for the purposes of calculating undue concentration. Phase 1 businesses were exempt from a finding of undue concentration as part of phase 3 retail round 1. So when they initially applied in 2018, their application could be processed by the department regardless of the number of licenses that DCR had already issued as part of phase 1. That's one of the reasons why Central City North, Venice reached undue concentration and exceeded undue concentration during phase 1 processing. So phase 1 licenses count toward undue concentration, but the original phase 1 application was exempt from a finding of undue concentration. So that just means that a PCN finding from the city council would not be required for DCR to process a phase 1 application.
Thank you, Jason. Moving on, again, a question from Levon. When will the DCR licensing map and the undue concentration list be updated?
They should be updated by Friday of this week. I'm reviewing the final layers, and once I approve them, they can be posted to our Google Map.
Joseph A. asks, we are stuck with a location with extremely high rent. We took over a retail location with no construction needed. Can we get a provisional to operate while we wait for our hearing date?
Unfortunately, there's not enough information for me to respond. So if an entity, so there could be a couple of things happening here. So if DCR issued temporary approval to a business entity and Joseph became an owner of that entity still has that temporary approval. And if you have a state provisional license, you would be able to operate while you're going through the community meeting and public hearing process for annual licensure. If there was an entity substitution done and the applicant, the business entity applying for the license changed and you don't have temporary approval, you would have to request a provisional license from the state. And assuming that you're a social equity applicant or you have your state provisional license, then you could request temporary approval from DCR, pay the initial inspection fee, pass an initial inspection, and then get temporary approval from DCR while you're navigating through the community meeting and public hearing process for your annual license. I would recommend reaching out to your assigned analyst because they can speak more to the specific facts of your particular record and what your options could be.
This is another question from Joseph. Is there a way to expedite a hearing date? I understand it might take up to 180 days, which might be an issue for us.
Again, this is something that you're going to have to reach out directly to your analyst to discuss. In order to get a public hearing date before the Cannabis Regulation Commission, your annual license application has to be deemed filed, and we need to issue a notice of complete application. And then that starts the ball rolling towards scheduling you for a community meeting and then scheduling your public hearing. Right now, we're working on the list of records that are going to be issued their notice of complete application, and we're going to do the mailed notice for the July 18th meeting and then the 2 meetings in August. And that notice is going to be done sometime in the first half of June. So I would reach out to your analyst, talk to them to see if there's a way for your application to be issued its notice of complete application as part of that tranche, and then you could potentially be scheduled for a community meeting and a public hearing in July or August.
The next question comes from Stephanie R. Excuse me. What fees pertain to an entity substitution? For example, when you look at the fee schedule, which fees would it fall under? And can you give an estimate on how much an entity substitution modification would cost?
So the entity substitution process, it's initially a 542 fee for us to review to determine whether or not we can process that entity substitution. Again, we can only consider an entity substitution for a location that has been issued a license. What happens is if we determine we can consider an entity substitution, the new applicant entity would have to submit a new full application. So they would have to pay the annual license application fee for each of the activities, as well as pay the fees associated with the legal business entity record. And, if it's a social equity record, you'd have to, in addition to the basic legal business entity fees, pay for DCR to conduct an equity share review of the entity. So I would say ballpark, you're probably looking at least $9,000 to $10,000 for a single activity, and then it would be an extra $7,500 to $8,000 for each additional activity.
This is an additional question from Stephanie. How long does a DCR licensing analyst take to review an ownership structure change modification if all the fees are paid and have been processed by the Office of Finance? And then they go on to say that they submitted their ownership structure about 2 months ago and have not received any updates. Is there a deadline for an analyst to respond to inquiries sent via email?
For this particular one, if Stephanie could send me an email, I can follow up with your assigned analyst. Generally, you're getting some kind of feedback within 30 to 60 days. And then if it's a change to a legal business entity record where we've conducted the equity share review, we do need to have the ownership modification also reviewed by the team that does the equity share review to make sure that the change still complies with the requirements of LAMC section 10420. And the analyst that's processing the modification request may be waiting for feedback on that follow-up equity share review to make sure that it complies. So unfortunately, we don't answer questions tied to specific records as part of the Q&A sessions. But if you send me an email, I can go ahead and look up the record and make sure that I connect with the analyst so that you're getting some kind of feedback on any emails that you may have sent. And, just as a quick follow-up to that, hopefully you're sending your emails to the DCR licensing account because there are multiple folks that are going through that email account on a daily basis and making sure that those email inquiries are being routed to various parties within the department to respond. If you are reaching out directly to an analyst, that analyst may be on vacation, they may be on family medical leave, there may be some other circumstance that's keeping them away from, their job. And since I can't look into everybody's email inbox, there's nobody there fishing stuff out when somebody is on vacation, on, family medical leave or anything else. So hopefully that inquiry did go through our DCR licensing email account.
And we'll have someone put the DCR licensing in the chat. I see they just did that. Thank you for that. Our question from L'Oreal A. When applying for a license, are there any sponsorships to cover associated fees?
I don't know what's meant by sponsorships. But from time to time, DCR receives state grant monies, which allow for us to provide fee waivers to social equity applicants. We did just get approved for a cannabis equity grant for calendar year 2024, and either we submitted the final paperwork to the state or we're in the process of submitting the final paperwork to the state. And we anticipate getting an initial grant disbursement sometime in July, which will allow for us to provide limited fee waivers to folks, again, that are social equity. submitting applications for new license records. There are some other grant programs that we are administering where existing applicants and licensees may be eligible to receive fee waivers or fee deferrals. It's best if you have an application in the queue to reach out to your analyst or the social equity team to see if there's any programs that can assist you. If you're a prospective applicant and you're a verified social equity individual, you can reach out to the social equity team to see what programs may be available to assist you.
Our next question comes from Kevin W. How can I expedite my social equity application?
So DCR is not offering expedited services at the moment. Depending on when you came into the application processing queue, it would be a good idea for you to reach out to your assigned analyst for your annual license application, and or if you haven't already submitted your equity share documents, the operating agreements, and any agreements that the social equity individual applicant may have with other owners or companies assisting with the management of the license or the prospective license, I would make sure you get that in, because a social equity license, such as temporary approval, can't be issued without DCR having completed that equity share review. So making sure you get all of the documents in and you're responding to the analysts that are processing the different records is the best way to make sure that your application gets processed in an expedited manner.
Our next question from JB. Besides cash, what other options do dispensaries have for accepting payments?
I mean, there's a number of dispensaries that have bank accounts that are accepting various types of checks and electronic payments, debit cards, credit cards, etc. Unfortunately, we can't provide business advice, and we don't have any approved vendors or anything else that provide payment options to folks that are in the cannabis space. But you can probably do a quick Google search, and or if you're a social equity applicant, there should be modules within the learning management system that talk about accounting, raising capital, and banking that may be of assistance to you.
Stephanie R. asks, can 51% ownership percentage split between two verified social equity applicants be accepted?
The simple answer to the question is yes. The more complicated answer to the question is yes, depending on what phase the record was submitted, there may be a qualifying social equity individual applicant on the record, and that individual is required to be on the record until a license is issued. For instance, an example is for a phase 3 retail round 2 record, the individual selected via the lottery will have to stay on the application until a license gets issued, but they could partner with another verified social equity individual applicant to aggregate their ownership equity to meet the 51%. And, in that circumstance, the individual selected could own 1% of the applicant entity, and the other verified social equity applicant could own 50% of the applicant entity. And that meets the requirements for the selected individual being listed and having an equity stake in the applicant entity, as well as the 51% ownership requirement under 10420. So hopefully that helps.
Our next question comes from Jorge T. If an abandoned application is refiled and later withdrawn by the applicant during the temporary approval process, will the application be able to be refiled given it is refiled within the 3-year timeframe from when it was first abandoned?
The answer is no. Um, when a record is abandoned, it may only be refiled one time. So if you refile the abandoned record and it's later abandoned or withdrawn for any reason, you've already used your one opportunity to refile. So you would not be eligible to refile a second time.
Okay, moving on from Mike S. Can you please elaborate on what constitutes a physical modification to a business premises? And there are some examples here. If walls, doors, windows, hallways, and cameras are not being touched, would a retail license need to get approval from DCR in order to add additional display cases, countertop space in the retail sales area? That's the first part. I'll stop there.
My simple answer would be to look at the business premises diagram that was approved by the department. And if your changes are not going to necessitate an update to the business premises diagram on file, you wouldn't have to submit a modification request. Things like adding walls, doors, windows, hallways, cameras, etc. Those are all things that are going to trigger a change in the adopted business premises diagram. But most people don't have display cases or other furniture listed on their business premises diagram. So adding display cases, adding a countertop, moving a countertop, adding seats wouldn't trigger a modification request.
And there's a second part to this question. It might have the same answer. How about if they want to remove, or add additional POS systems? Would this require any modification or notification to DCR?
Again, unless there's some tenant improvement that's being triggered by moving the point of sales equipment, you wouldn't have to submit a business premises diagram. What you may want to do is reach out to the compliance and enforcement division, just to chat with an inspector that may have inspected your location, to just verify with them such a change wouldn't trigger any type of compliance issue for them. But in general, on paper, we're really looking at the built environment against what you submitted on your business premises diagram. And if that's not changing, the licensing team would not need to review or process a business premises modification.
Thank you, Jason. Our next question comes from two individuals, Wes F. and Mike S. Being that receiving a retail emblem heavily relies on other agencies, what are the chances that the January 1st, 2025 deadline gets extended? And then additionally, does DCR have discretion to allow retailers to operate in 2025 without the emblem?
So for the first part of the question, I don't know what the chances are of that deadline getting extended. I know that the director is supportive of amending that language in some way to allow for existing operators to continue to operate while they seek to meet the requirements to receive an emblem. That said, the emblem program is a memorandum of agreement between the city and the county of Los Angeles. So one piece of changing that deadline is making sure that the county is supportive of it. And if they are, then we would have to propose an amendment to the municipal code to implement or effectuate some type of change to that deadline. DCR does not have the discretion to override that requirement, and it makes it a misdemeanor for an operator to continue to operate after January 1st of 2025 without a retail emblem. And as folks know, DCR isn't responsible for filing or seeking misdemeanor charges against applicants. That's something that would be handled by the city attorney's office, and we have no control or direction over their office or how they're going to do filings. So again, this kind of falls into that area where operators have to comply with all of the normal requirements of all of their agencies. And just like failing to pull business permits or fire permits or alarm permits, it could subject you to citation by other agencies. And in this case, unfortunately, it would be possibly the city attorney's office filing misdemeanor charges against the business entity and potentially its owners.
Juan S. asks, when will new applications be accepted?
Applications for manufacturing, distribution, transport only, testing labs. We're currently accepting those applications from all applicants. For non-storefront delivery, we're accepting applications from verified social equity applicants. And we anticipate, subject to the approval of council, conducting a lottery as soon as the municipal code is updated to allow for us to do another equity share verification process and then conduct a lottery both for the remaining retail storefront application spots as well as the cultivation application spots. So for anything that requires a lottery, there will be public notice, and we don't have any defined dates yet. But if you fall into one of the other application categories, you should be able to submit it now through the system.
Thank you, Jason. Our next question from John L. What are the most common mistakes applicants make during the licensing process, and how can they be avoided?
I would say the most common mistake is getting into an application process before you're ready to move forward. So, an example of that is when you file for your legal business entity record, if you have to raise capital, you're looking for other owners, those are all things that may result in your entity documents not being complete. And of course, if your entity documents are not complete, your application can't be deemed filed, and we can't move forward with issuing you a license for that specific entity. So, I know that there were earlier questions that were from social equity individual applicants that were looking to raise capital and find investors and do other stuff. Really, you should work out those issues before you attempt to move forward with getting a license because, again, there's different processing deadlines. And if you can't get your information in, that will result in the abandonment of your record at some point in time. And again, refiling, you only get to do one time. So if you miss the opportunity on your initial filing, you're abandoned, and then you refile and you miss the filing requirements again, you've lost that opportunity. And that's the most common mistake that applicants make, is trying to get into the application process before they're ready to navigate through the entire process.
Thank you, Jason. The next question comes from Steve B. All of the premises identified in the utility disconnection list in the DCR licensing map ineligible for licensure. The map does not indicate when the utilities were cut or if the utilities were cut in compliance with a LAMC 104.15E, only that there has been a utility disconnection.
So for licensing purposes, we populate that layer with information that our compliance and enforcement division gets. And the rendering of a layer is intended to allow the prospective applicant to know that something may have happened at that location because you're going to the landlord to get them to sign the landowner attestation where they're saying that the property has not been subjected to any of the things for it to be deemed ineligible. And then two, for the actual licensing team member who's doing your business premises pre-application review to then know that something may have happened so that they can reach out to the compliance and enforcement division to see whether or not that action would result in the location being ineligible. So for everybody's purposes, if there's a pre-app that gets submitted, that initiates the process where we can do further review to see if that particular utility disconnection or enforcement action rises to the level to prevent DCR from considering an application at the location. And really the only true way to know is if there's a pre-application record that's being worked on.
Thank you. Ivan D asks, when is the PCN process opening and how much time will applicants have to find properties? Are there any new community plan areas open for PCN?
So we don't have any plans right now to reopen the PCN process. We're working on a report to City Council to recommend some amendments to the municipal code. Big amendments include updating the social equity criteria, grandfathering in folks that were verified under, the 2019 or the 2024, or sorry, the 2022 social equity criteria that met 2 out of the 3 criteria, proposing amendments to allow for us to conduct a cultivation lottery. And, once council considers those recommendations, depending on if they're adopted or not adopted or amended, that would really drive how quickly we can do the next verification process, which historically has been a prerequisite to us opening up a lottery or conducting the PCN process. So again, we're planning to submit a report to City Council sometime this summer. And once it gets submitted, I'm sure we'll raise it during a future Q&A session or a webinar. And you'll just want to kind of track that council file because that'll really drive the timelines for everything else we do.
Next question from Jonathan D. Is it still possible to get a retail license?
There's still retail license capacity within the city. You would have to be selected through some kind of process to be able to submit a retail storefront application. As I was mentioning in the prior question, we've got some proposals that we'll be transmitting to City Council this summer that will drive how quickly we open up the next lottery process and what that looks like. But there would be future opportunities for people to get verified and apply to be considered for the lottery. And, DCR is accepting type 9 applications, which are for the non-storefront delivery retail license type from verified social equity applicants. So it is still possible to apply for a retail license. It really just depends on what type of license you're applying for and what type of process you would have to go through in order to be eligible to submit that application.
Our next question also comes from Jonathan. What are the odds of being accepted as a social equity applicant?
I would recommend you review the social equity individual applicant criteria under Municipal Code Section 10420, because that'll tell you what DCR is looking for an individual to be verified as a social equity individual applicant. And then as far as it goes for the social equity applicant, which is the entity applying for the license, generally 51% of the ownership of that entity has to be made up of social equity individual applicants. And then your entity and the operating agreements have to comply with Section 10420. So as long as you meet the requirements as stated in the code, we would be able to consider you as either a social equity individual applicant or a social equity applicant. We do verifications periods for social equity individual applicants. So if you've not been verified yet, you'll have to wait for us to open up a new verification period and then apply to be verified and submit the required documentation.
Next question comes from Rob R. The Business Licensing and Compliance Assistance webinar said entity substitutions and relocations won't be allowed after annual license is issued. Is this true?
As the statement was given, it's factually incorrect. The entity substitutions and relocations are not accepted after a notice of complete application is issued. Because basically we've completed our environmental analysis and we're preparing the staff report to recommend the issuance of an annual license. And that is entity and location specific. So once we've gotten into a notice of complete application, there's no changes allowed. Once an annual license is issued, you would still be able to then go and submit an entity substitution or relocation request for that annual license. But you would have to wait until the license is issued.
Thank you, Jason. Our next question comes from Honey. What does the federal rescheduling of cannabis mean for retail cannabis?
Until it happens, I honestly could not provide you a definitive answer. If it's rescheduled from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, which is something that's been proposed, it would change the requirements for how and who would have the authority to sell cannabis. It may subject cannabis businesses to different federal requirements, which, as long as it's prohibited, they're not currently, required to meet because it's federally prohibited. I think at a minimum, it's going to add some level of federal bureaucracy to the process. So, like most businesses, instead of just having to deal with the local and state governments like California cannabis businesses deal with, you're going to have to deal with local, state, and federal regulators as you try to operate your business. So I think at a minimum, either rescheduling or federal legalization is going to add a new level of bureaucracy to an already very bureaucratic application and licensure process. The benefits of rescheduling or descheduling cannabis would be, opening up access to federal programs, both economic programs, economic and workforce development programs, potentially grant programs, different types of funding for research and other things, standardized rules, access to banking. So there's a lot of benefits that can come with it. But there are also bureaucratic challenges that could come with it. If businesses are recognized by the federal government, that would open up for them to be treated like any other business with the IRS to allow for operating expenses and other things to be deducted from operating revenue, et cetera. So it should reduce your federal tax obligations. But again, until something happens and we have an idea of what that federal framework is going to look like, it's all just speculation.
Thanks, Jason. Our next question comes from Steve B. And he's asking about an online high school that is within 700 feet of where we want to locate a dispensary. There is no on-site instruction. The location shows up on the California Department of Education website. Can we move forward with this location?
So the only way to give you a definitive answer is for a either relocation request or pre-application review record to be submitted and paid for. When we did the amendment to 105 back in 2021 or 2020, we did require that on-site instruction was there. So if it is 100% virtual, when we do our sensitive use review, it would not rise to the level of being a sensitive use, even if they were licensed by the California Department of Education. But again, we wouldn't do that analysis to make that determination without a record being before us. But if there is no on-site instruction, it would not be considered a sensitive use.
Thank you, Jason. Our next question from MS. What is the best case and worst case timeframes for retail storefront pre-app review?
Hypothetically, best case, like you submit the request, you take your invoice, you have an appointment with the Office of Finance to pay your fee. It shows up in an LA tax report. When we pull the report for the weekly processing, and that's done within 1 to 2 weeks, and we get it processed within 30 days of that. So it's processed within 45 days. The worst case, you submit a pre-app review record, you wait the full 30 days to mail in your payment. It takes that mailed in payment 2 weeks to navigate to the Office of Finance Cannabis Support Unit to process it. It takes another week to get processed and show up on an LA tax report. And then we take the full 30 days to do the review, and you're looking at 3 or 4 months at that time. So best case scenario is you get the invoice and you're able to pay it as soon as possible, and it shows up on the LA tax report. We apply the payment in Excel and we start working on your record. Worst case scenario, you have to use the full amount of time allowed to submit your payment, and we don't get confirmation of that payment for several weeks, which delays our ability to start processing.
Thank you. MS also asks, can an owner of a non-retail license transfer their entire ownership interest to other owners on the record, or do they have to wait to receive their annual license from DCR first?
Good question, but there's 2 buckets. So you've got general licenses that are not subject to equity share review or the social equity program, and then you have licenses that are subject to the social equity program in LAMC 10420. For an existing owner to transfer their ownership interest to other owners on the record, for a general record, that's pretty quick because it's not changing the operating agreement. It's not changing any of the dynamics associated with the applicant or licensee. It's really just you submitting the documentation, somebody acknowledging that they're going to be removed as an owner and moving that equity to other owners. If the record is subject to the requirements of 10420, we're going to have to make sure that the social equity component of the ownership is still maintained. And of course, if it's not maintained, we wouldn't be able to process the request. But once a license has been issued, we have the ability to process an ownership modification in compliance with the municipal code. So if you have temporary approval, that's a formal licensure, which would allow for us to do that review prior to an annual license being issued.
Thank you. Our next question from Christian C. Can you please clarify how long a social equity lottery retailer can operate with a temporary approval status before they are required to undergo the annual license application? And then they go on, is it after 1 year of having temporary approval or by a certain year, such as January 1st, 2026?
There, again, there's going to be a layer of complexity to the question. For folks that have temporary approval, that temporary approval can only be renewed for X number of cycles, as stated in the municipal code. With the adoption of Senate Bill 51, which went into law January 1st of 2024, that Senate bill created a pathway for the state's Department of Cannabis Control to issue new provisional licenses to social equity retailers. DCR was able to get an ordinance amendment passed to allow for us to continue issuing temporary approval to social equity applicants pursuing a retail license. So there's not like one fixed date that applies to every social equity lottery winner. It's really going to come down to when you receive temporary approval, whether it's, you've already received it or you haven't even submitted your application. Those are going to be two different dates. And because it is record specific, I would recommend you send us an email and you reach out to your analyst so we can look at the record and provide a more concrete answer for your specific circumstance.
Let's see our next question from MS. Can a City of LA cannabis license owner hold a seat on their local neighborhood council?
I would recommend talking to the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment, which, is the regulatory or administrative body for the city's neighborhood councils, and or you may have to submit something in writing to the city attorney's office for them to do an ethics check. The holding a seat on your neighborhood council unassociated with cannabis or making recommendations in support of businesses, etc., would not necessarily run afoul of the code. But if you're basically taking an action on a cannabis business that may run afoul of the municipal code, which prevents the owners from being part of the regulatory oversight or enforcement of cannabis related activities.
Thank you, Jason. I think our staff put in the email address for Department of Neighborhood Empowerment, so if they need that. Our next and looks like final question, right on time, Jason, from MS. Does DCR believe that they will be able to conduct compliance inspections this year for all licensees who paid for one through the 2024 renewal process? And then the second part, if not, will the fee carry over for licenses who were not scheduled in 2024?
Yeah, we're on track to get all of the compliance inspections done this year. The good news is because those positions are full cost recovery, the Compliance and Enforcement Division will have 4 full-time special investigators in addition to the other folks that have already been allocated to the program. And the additional 2 of the additional special investigators will start in July, and we can start the hiring process for the other 2 sometime in September. So we're going to be expanding our capacity to process them. And everybody who paid for a compliance inspection should have it done within this calendar year. And of course, they will need to pay for their 2025 compliance inspection as part of the renewal process if they have a license to engage in commercial cannabis activity.
Thank you, Jason. I think we cleared all the questions.
Right on time. Thank you. I just want to thank everybody for coming today. We really appreciate it. Our team will get this recording up on our website so you can listen to it again, or folks that weren't able to attend will be able to listen through it. Our next Q&A virtual lunch is scheduled for Wednesday, June 12th at noon. So look forward to answering more questions and talking to folks again. Have a great day. Bye.